Well, for the past couple of weeks, I've been locked down in my corrugated iron shed, huddled into a corner around the warming glow of my TV as I've spent 20 or so hours of my time with Arkane Studios' new shooter, Deathloop. A game about a man stuck in a violent, repetitive cycle, waking up each day and forced to relive the same events over and over, with no apparent means of escape, kinda like life in 2021. Yep, the time has come, and so have I. Deathloop is finally out. Available currently for Microsoft Windows and the PlayStation 5.
Oh, okay.
And I do have a fair bit to say about this one, positive and negative, but my real takeaway I think is that this is going to be a really divisive game that I think people are either really going to love or hate.
Schwacked.
The first couple of hours with this thing is really slow and, to be honest, just not all that great. But it is a game that also gets exponentially better the more time you spend with it, even if it does lack a lot of the gameplay intricacies and moral decisions that other Arkane Studios games often force the player to consider. Is it worth your hard-earned dollary dues though? Well, let's find out.
Let's, break some loops.
Now, Deathloop certainly has an interesting premise. You're playing as a guy named Colt, waking up on a beach on the fictional island of Black Reef, harbouring a serious hangover and a bad case of amnesia. Turns out the island is ground zero for some kind of top secret experiment, which has meant that everyone on the island is caught in a time loop that keeps repeating the same day over and over. It's just like that one Bill Murray movie, Caddyshack. Turns out that this was all intentional though, and everyone on the island is in on the joke, treating Colt as a hostile interloper that they attack on sight. That is, when their AI actually allows them to see him. For some reason though, Colt and a mysterious woman named Juliana retain their memories across each loop, and Juliana pops up throughout the game to try and stop Colt from succeeding. This also forms the multiplayer aspect of the game as well, because if you're playing this online, anyone can join your game as Juliana and try to kill you, and it's pretty damn obvious when it's an actual person doing this instead of the AI.
Gotcha, bitch!
There's like a whole new side mode here. We can level up and unlock new gear. Either way though, the main focus of the campaign is playing as Colt, and he's stuck with this complex task of uncovering what's happened on the island, and to try to break this cycle becomes the absolute core of the game.
Okay, it's been a pretty shitty morning, or two, so I'm done. With you and all of this, it ends today.
Compared to previous Arkane games that made the player deal with that moral conundrum of whether or not it was worth taking a life, Deathloop just does away with that entirely, allowing you to pretty much wipe out everyone on the island. Performing vicious barehanded takedowns where you twist someone's neck around so violently that it just sounds like you're bitten into a big old spoonful of cornflakes. Deathloop has a night and day cycle which is broken up into morning, noon, afternoon, and evening. And throughout all of these 4 different time periods, there's key events which are always going to happen. Each night the whole thing culminates in a party at a heavily guarded manor where all the city's elite get together like it's the end of the world, which it kind of is. Because yeah, it wouldn't be an Arkane Studios game without there being at least one mission taking place around a party. Along with including that mechanic of being able to kick people off ledges.
Now that has a ring to it.
The weather even changes throughout the day as well, even starting to snow by the afternoon, so you can really see a shift in the city throughout the day, which makes you forget that you're really only exploring the same 4 locations over and over. Gameplay wise, it's very reminiscent of playing through like a watered down version of the other Arkane games, mostly Dishonored. It also kind of reminded me a bit of Bioshock. The premise of all of these scientific and artistic minds coming together in one place and ironically creating this kind of inescapable situation. Artists, scientists, musicians, and hedonists with dreams of grandeur all stuck in this living hell. In Bioshock, it's obviously Rapture at the bottom of the sea, and in Deathloop, it's the city of Black Reef that's caught in this time loop. And much like Bioshock, I think Deathloop also does a great job of capturing the time period. It's also kind of cool to see Arkane embracing their developer DNA as well. Now, I don't know what kind of peripherals they had back in the 1960s, but I can bet they didn't have anything as good as what Steelseries puts out. Yes, that time of the week again, where I have to take a quick minute to thank my awesome sponsor, Steelseries. These guys make some of the best gaming peripherals, including mice, keyboards, pads, and headsets. Now, I never recommend a product that I don't use myself, and I've been using their Apex Pro wired keyboard for a while now, along with the Rival 5 gaming mouse, and I gotta say, these things still look as good as the day I got them. They also make really good headsets, and I'm a huge fan of the Arkane wireless, which lets me adjust the audio for both the game and the voice chat separately. Not to mention, they're just really comfy sitting on my ugly misshapen head. If you're into mouse pads, which you really should be, they've also got you covered. They just make some really great high quality products, and I can't recommend these guys enough. So if you're thinking it's time for an upgrade, well, make sure to use the promo code GMAN at checkout, and you can even get 12% off your next order. Right, so one thing that immediately sticks out here is just how good the whole thing looks. And I think Deathloop really does have an awesome visual style. There's just so few games that take place in the 1960s. I mean, the only ones that really come to mind are No One Lives Forever and We Happy Few. In fact, the overall vibe and art style here reminded me a lot of We Happy Few in particular, especially that whole scavenging and surviving aspect. It's also a really colourful and vibrant world. The shift in lighting as the day progresses looks great, and every single area is just cluttered with props and objects, making the environment seem real and lived in. Now, I've played this on both the PS5 and the PC, and I've got some bad news for PC owners in that this thing doesn't seem to run all that great. I've got a 3080 Ti, 64GB of RAM and an i7, and I still struggle to get a decent frame rate at times, which is pretty damn shocking. I more than exceed those recommended PC specs. I even swallowed my pride and dropped the resolution back down to 1080 like a complete pleb, but it didn't seem to fix a goddamn thing. Now, I'm pretty sure that Deathloop uses Denuvo, and I know that there's conflicting information out there on whether or not that actually affects performance. But all I know is that every game that I've ever played that uses it seems to run like crap. So I mean, off the back of that, all I can do is make my own assumptions and assume it does. I mean, it doesn't run terribly, but it just always seems to feel very choppy, with it just struggling to maintain a smooth frame rate. The PS5 version, on the other hand, runs really smoothly at 60 FPS the entire time, but it's also got a mode that turns on ray tracing, capping the frame rate instead at 30. Though, I think that's not the kind of trade-off that I want. It'd be like dating a supermodel with Tourette syndrome.
Holy shit!
The only real main benefit the PC version has is that it's got an FOV slider, and obviously the shooting's going to be much easier with a mouse and a keyboard, but whether or not that's worth taking a hit on how smooth the whole thing plays, I guess is up to the person playing. It's just a shame considering how good the game world mostly looks. Even something as innocuous as a notepad on a desk can give away crucial information. There's a whole lot more to Deathloop here though than just reading things and picking up items. It actually throws a whole bunch of mechanics at you to begin with, literally like a dozen different mechanics within the span of about 10 minutes, all of which are explained through text pop-ups, which is kinda lazy. Which is actually kind of ironic because it is a pretty easy concept to explain. You see, this whole nasty loop that Colt's stuck in can only be ended if he manages to find and kill all these key figures on the island called Visionaries.
Slow down, you little shit!
The only problem is that these guys are all off doing their own things on each area of the island throughout the day. Each day starts with Colt leaving his hideout and then venturing out into an area of the island. Then becomes a matter of investigating, finding clues, completing missions, and trying to somehow get all of these guys in one place at the same time, or at least 2 or 3 of them at once.
There's got to be a way to kill 2 of them at once, or 3, or 4, or more.
One of the first visionaries I went after was Harriet, who only appears in the morning giving a weird sermon to a group of her cultish followers in this abandoned Air Force hangar. But after that, at any other time of the day, it's impossible to get her. So regardless of what happens throughout all of these other 3 time periods, I knew that I'd always end up having to go and kill her in the morning, right? Thankfully, there's no time limit for any of this, so you can take as long as you want to explore, find clues, stab a bitch, or just go around causing all out mayhem. The main missions are obviously for finding and killing all these visionaries, but there's also quite a few optional missions as well, like finding better weapons for Colt to play around with, or just figuring out alternative ways to kill people off. Initially, you've got to deal with a pretty massive handicap of losing all of your weapons and abilities when the day resets, and yeah, that's a pretty big setback. Running around the island until you wear the soles off your shoes and getting all this cool gear ain't gonna mean jack shit if you lose it each evening. And trying to kill these visionaries early on when you're under-equipped is like trying to beat a grizzly bear to death with a pumice stone. So pretty early on in the game, thankfully, you unlock the ability to hold onto items across loops by infusing them with a resource called Residuum. Residuum? Fuck!
Oh yeah! It actually worked!
enemies and visionaries drop player or weapon upgrades, and the way that this works is that you then sacrifice these items to turn them into residuum, then spend that residuum to infuse the stuff you want to keep. Savvy? Like holding onto upgrades for your weapons to improve things like faster reload times. There's trinkets for Colt that improve his health regeneration or sprint speed, or just more importantly, holding onto all the badass guns and abilities you come across. And if you thought you were just going to be killed once and then that was the end of it, well, think again. Because you've even got a slab here called Reprise that means you're able to be killed twice before the loop resets. And even then, if you are killed, you're able to just mosey on back to where your corpse is and pick up all the residuum that you lost anyway. Deathloop initially even has this whole Far Cry 2 thing, where some of the weapons you pick up are going to have a high tendency to jam when firing. But once you start finding better guns, which are all graded by rarity like a standard RPG, it's a mechanic that you'll completely forget exists. To the point that I wonder why they even bothered to put it in the game at all. The most fun weapons are definitely the ones you get from these side missions, like these dual pistols which can be combined to make a burst fire SMG, and a lever action shotgun that fires off fart gas. But even just the basic SMGs, revolvers and pistols can be pretty powerful with the right upgrades. And when the combat all clicks with these different abilities in play, I gotta say, it's pretty damn fun. I mean, you're not gonna be doing half the stuff they show off in the trailers. I think the likelihood of enemies being in these perfectly placed positions is just a marketing tool, but you can unleash the right amount of endorphin releasing carnage here with pretty much no repercussions. Plus, it also comes with all of the other accoutrements you'd expect in a game that's riding the line on being an immersive sim, like hacking into cameras and turrets with your little doohickey gadget thingy, which for some reason just never seems to run out, and can be used to control any camera or turret that you can get in reach of. Same thing with jamming the radios for scout enemies so they can't call in reinforcements. It doesn't cost resources, and once it's hacked, that effect just seems to last forever, until the item either gets destroyed or you choose to shut it down. Gotta say though, I did find this pretty fun, turning turrets on unsuspecting groups of bad guys, and it's not uncommon to see a single turret just shred through half a dozen of these guys with absolute ease. Now, despite there being stealth mechanics in Deathloop, I really don't think they intended it to be played as one. I mean, you can avoid enemies and stay hidden if you want, but it's the bare bones mechanics needed to have a stealth system. That being, just stay out of an enemy's line of sight. If you're in their line of sight for too long, a little icon fills up and then they'll either go into combat mode or search your last known position out of suspicion. Whoa, I'm a poet and I didn't even realize.
Keep telling yourself that.
You don't have to worry about bodies being left behind because every time you kill someone, their body just vanishes into thin air pretty much instantly. These guys aren't the brightest crayons in the box either, and they have some pretty goddamn awful peripheral vision. I mean, compare that to Dishonored 2, where enemies could see you from the other side of the goddamn city, in between the gaps in fucking Venetian blinds or something. Your only melee weapon is a machete that's so goddamn huge, it looks like it could be used to circumcise a woolly mammoth. And nothing good ever happens to someone on the pointy end of one of these things.
Major lacerations detected.
The main silent weapon I think that most people are probably going to use is a nail gun, which is really only effective when aiming for someone's head. And I don't think I'm going to need to tell you that there's no such thing here as sleeping nails. There's only one kind of grenade as well, which is a standard frag grenade that does general grievous bodily harm to anyone standing near it. There's alternate modes for the grenade, turning it into a proximity bomb or even a tripwire, but both of those are still a lethal option, right? There's no stun grenades, no gas grenades, just a grenade designed to separate limbs from torsos. So it's a game where it makes no sense to leave enemies alive because when you're detected, it's just going to be one more person you've got to deal with. And I really kind of feel like they've done this for the people like myself who didn't really like the chaos system in the Dishonored games. Now, as a result, you've got relatively guilt-free murder here on tap. The fact the enemies look like storefront mannequins half the time makes me feel even less guilty for murdering them. And either way, they're going to be back the next morning anyway, so who really gives a shit? Now, I have always thought that Arkane Studios games really nailed the combat aspect, and that is kind of again the same in Deathloop. Like I said, you can minimize combat to a point if you just want to get to where you're going, but if the enemies do spot you, it really is more unfortunate for them than it is for you. That is, once you've unlocked the slabs anyway. Slabs are gained from killing off these visionaries, and they're the various powers that Colt can use. Sadly though, there's only 5 of them, and 2 of these are just straight out recycled from Dishonored. I mean, one of the earliest ones you're gonna get is Shift, which is literally just Blink from the Dishonored games. They didn't even really bother changing the animation or the effects for it, but I mean look, if nothing else, it does make navigation a lot easier once you find and upgrade it. The other one is called Nexus, where you can fire out this projectile and link a bunch of nearby enemies together. And then what happens to one of them happens to the whole bunch. Like, link a few guys together, shoot one in the head, and then they all drop like perfectly coordinated bags of shit. But again, it's kinda similar to Domino in Dishonored 2. Probably my favorite, I think, is Carnesis. Now, this is a telekinetic ability where you can throw enemies around in almost any direction, and it honestly never gets old throwing someone up in the air and shooting them before they land, or throwing them off a ledge and watching them tumble to their death. And I think it's kind of funny that here we are in 2021, and an ability that's basically just a Fuss Rodar is one of the most fun ones to use in the entire game. But again, like kinda similar to Wind Blast from Dishonored 2. It's just now you've got more control over where you can throw these guys. Havoc and either, but somewhat original, I guess. With Havoc, you gain a shield that prevents you from taking damage, along with amplifying the damage you dish out, a skill which is entirely focused around combat. Just again reinforcing my point, how the game really wants you to murder the piss out of everyone. Then on the flip side, Ether is a really handy cloak where you can turn invisible, making stealth much more easier, if that's the kind of thing you're going for. But I mean, neither of those are really all that creative. I mean, a damage buff and a shield and a cloak. It's been done before. Honestly too, I can't believe that in a game that's all about replaying events over and over and history repeating, that they didn't bring back something like that ability to stop time from the Dishonored games, or an ability where you could bring in another cult from a separate loop or something to help you out during combat, kind of like how the Doppelganger worked in Dishonored 2. You don't need to worry about consumables or anything either, because energy for these abilities recharges automatically over time. There's health pickups scattered all around the island, but there's no medkits or anything to hold on to, so again like your energy, it also regens automatically to a certain point after taking damage. And it just feels like a really dumbed down and simplified way to handle your resources. I also think it's a huge stuff up that you can only equip 2 of these slabs at once. Yeah, even though there's only 5 of these things, you're still forced to choose from 2 at a time. And because Shift is just so infinitely useful in every situation, I think it really makes it like you've only got 1 to choose from. Because I just can't imagine trying to play this without that incredibly useful ability to teleport short distances. Once you leave Colt's hidey hole at the beginning of each time period, you can't change these abilities either. It just seems very odd to me for a game made by a studio who've always been really good at creating sandbox worlds, where you can really go nuts with all of the tools they're giving you. So to put these outright limitations on what you can and can't bring with you, just seems out of place. And it definitely prevents the game from being as ludicrous and over the top as it could have been. Even something as simple as the game lacking the option to manual save, which I think really discourages experimentation. Now, I know this has been done intentionally to force you to have to kinda learn from your mistakes, as opposed to just being able to save scum and try again. But again, it just kind of all adds to the feeling of this being a watered down Dishonored.
Oh, they just disappeared?
More than that is how every weapon and ability seems designed to just straight out kill a bitch, and there's no non-lethal ways to take enemies out aside from just avoiding them entirely. This also goes for the Visionaries, and as far as I can tell, you have to kill these guys. There's no other way around it. This is not a game for pacifists, let's put it that way. There's a line of dialogue early in the game where Juliana mentions something about it being bad to kill people, but even once I'd finished the game with the kind of body count that'd make John Wick look like an amateur, it didn't seem to affect anything.
Oh, they just disappeared?
I mean, look, that's fine if all you want is a really fun power fantasy set in the 1960s, but people who are more used to the moral decisions that the previous Arkane Studios games constantly force the player to consider are gonna find this whole approach very simplified. What I'm probably most disappointed about though, is that there's really zero variety to the enemies outside of their appearance. They kind of remind me of a villain out of an old episode of Doctor Who or something, back in the 60s and 70s when the BBC had no budget, so they just throw bright outfits on someone to make them look more visually interesting. Enemies all just carry some kind of gun or melee weapon, and their tactics consist of little more than just often taking the path of least resistance towards you and then trying to shoot you. To the point that you can easily just bottleneck them into a single doorway and mow them down like complete assholes. You think that maybe the visionaries might be unique? These are the key members of the project who all have those unique slabs. So you'd think they'd all have their own strategies to learn and attack patterns, but no, they're pretty much just the same as the regular enemies. In fact, all of them can go down with the basic melee takedown or with a well-placed shot to the noggin. I think that Juliana is also incredibly underwhelming as an antagonist. She shows up for a bit at the start of the game, but in terms of advancing the story along, you only interact with her when she contacts you via radio. You never see her in a cinematic or anything.
Fuck! Why do you even like this place?
Because it is amazing!
Eventually, you'll find out the mystery behind who she is and why she's on the island pretty much at the end of the game, which is also the only other time you see her face to face in an expositional sense.
You're gonna give me that attitude?
Other than that though, when she invades your world like a Dark Souls spectre with an assault rifle, she's there for one reason, just to straight up murder your ass. I mean, she's not stopping by for tea, crumpets, or spotted dick. And this is what I meant when I said she's underwhelming, because all you really need to do against her is just kinda shoot her in the face a bunch of times until she dies. Assuming of course it's controlled by the AI and not another person. The PvP aspect is a whole nother kettle of fish, and this is where you play as Juliana and can invade other people's games to try to kill them, or vice versa. This is a standard leveling up system where at the end of a match you can earn new gear and even customize Juliana's loadout, even unlocking new outfits. Damn. Because yeah, walking around in brightly coloured eyesores for clothes is a great idea when you're trying to kill Colt without being seen, isn't it? You earn points for obviously killing Colt in various ways, but also just for surviving in the match. So even if you don't get the kill and it still took you 10 minutes, you're not going to leave empty-handed. This is a good idea. I wouldn't recommend playing this before you finish the game though, mostly because once you've finished it, you're going to be more aware of the layouts for the maps, the locations of everything, and the possible routes that other players are going to take to kill these visionaries. Either way though, this mode just doesn't seem fully fleshed out to me. I mean, for starters, some of the weapons in the slabs are just broken. Someone who's smart at using Havoc, for instance, is going to be pretty much untouchable. Certain guns are also way more overpowered than others, like the guns that leave behind gas clouds do so much damage over time that it's pretty much impossible to avoid. As Juliana, you've got to kill Colt essentially 3 times, whereas Colt only needs to kill you once, so yeah, not the best odds. I think it also uses peer-to-peer, which means the latency is going to be really bad in some matches too. Honestly, half the time it was borderline unplayable. And I'm kind of amazed I was even able to score any kills when I was zipping all over the place like I was on a DSL connection back from 1999. I guess technically though, there is infinite replayability here, so it has got that going for it. And if you really want to, you can actually join a friends match and help them out like it's a co-op mode. But overall, it just feels like a cool concept that's not as fleshed out as it could have been. I think most people are probably just going to turn it to the single player mode, meaning that the AI is going to invade their game instead of another player, and that's a damn shame. Finally, I know that Deathloop is repetitive by design. The whole point of the game is to replay the same days over and over, but look, an ironically repetitive game is still repetitive. And there really is a sense of certain missions just being as drawn out and tedious as possible, almost in some kind of way to extend the time the player has to invest in the game. I mean look, for one mission, I had to get into 4 separate hidden bunkers across the island for reasons I won't spoil. And the only way to do this was to power up a terminal in the power plant, which could only be done in the morning. This meant having to go and power up 2 generators, dealing with the nearby enemies beforehand every time, then using that diverted power to unlock one of the bunkers. The thing is, you can only unlock 1 bunker at a time, and the power plant is only accessible in the morning. So it was really just a matter of going through the exact same motions 4 times to unlock the 4 separate bunkers across 4 separate days. Yeah, fun. The worst one is when it gives you a clue to go somewhere at a particular time, only for it to then immediately tell you to come back later on instead.
Gonna have to come back in the afternoon.
Are you shitting me?
The only way to upgrade the slabs is by picking up the same slab again, which means just going back and killing the visionaries over and over. This does get easier as you become stronger and more equipped, but it's the same process every single time. And I don't know man, for a full price game to have such repetitive gameplay, I mean they're charging up to $130 here in Australia. I don't know man, at times it doesn't feel like it's worth the dollary dues. One thing I learned pretty quickly playing Deathloop is that despite everything being available from the get-go, you're often just simply not going to be able to tackle certain missions or objectives effectively. I learnt this pretty early on during a mission where I was trying to take out one of the visionaries. I just couldn't manage to get through it without having my ass handed to me. So what did I do? Well, I went off and I did other missions for a bit. I went off and killed Harriet for the first time, which gave me the Nexus ability. Then I went off and killed Fia, who drops the useful Havoc Slab, along with just getting some better guns and trinkets along the way. Then I was able to go back and tear that first visionary a new asshole, and it felt pretty damn fulfilling.
Remind me why I can't have a cold storm.
And this is the kind of thing where I can see that some people would be willing to swallow their pride and go off and chase other missions for a bit, whereas other players might just keep bashing their head on that wall over and over, trying to finish that first mission until it somehow managed to click. That's why I said earlier how I think this game is really going to garner some polar opposite opinions. I think we've become so spoiled with games these days, where more often than not with most modern titles, you can pretty much do anything or everything you want from the get-go. To be faced with something like a locked door with a combination that might not present itself for another 4 or 5 hours, I mean, it does kind of go against the grain a bit. This is overall a good thing, but it's also why I think this game is going to be so divisive. I know for me personally, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Arkane Studios games. I loved Dishonored 1, but I hated Dishonored 2. I initially didn't like Prey, but then ended up loving it, and the same thing with Deathloop. At first it seemed like a confusing and convoluted mess, but when all the pieces started to come together, figuratively and literally, it ended up being a pretty fun game.
Let's, break some loops.
It's a bit of a shame the PC version runs so horribly though, and given the way Dishonored 2 got treated on that front, I won't be holding my breath for this to get fixed anytime soon either. It's not a perfect experience, but when it all came together for that 17 or so hours it took me to finish it, it did do a good enough job of making me forget that I was still stuck living in 2021.
I'm gonna drop you now. Wait, no, wait!
Fuck!
No!